They came home to nothing. Not a little bit of nothing. Not starting from scratch with some savings in the bank. Actual nothing. A duffel bag. A uniform that smelled like 3 years of war. And a country that had no idea what to do with them. Here is what they never teach you in school. The men who rebuilt America after the Second World War. The men who built the suburbs and the factories and the middle class that everyone talks about like it was some kind of miracle. Those men did not have a plan. They did not have a mentor. They did not have a podcast telling them about passive income and morning routines. They had fear. They had hunger. And they had something that has been almost completely stripped out of the modern man. They had a visceral, bone-deep understanding that no one was coming to save them. That is the secret that got buried under 60 years of comfort. And by the end of this, you are going to understand not just what those men did, but why it worked, and why the system that came after them was specifically designed to make sure you never figure it out. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1946. Imagine a train platform somewhere in the middle of the country. Could be Ohio, could be Georgia, could be anywhere. A man steps off that train, 23 years old, and he squints at the town he left 3 years ago. Same hardware store, same diner, same water tower with the name of the town painted on the side. But everything feels different. He feels different. He has seen things that change the wiring in his brain permanently. He watched his friends die. He killed people. He went months without sleeping in a real bed. And now he is supposed to just, what, go back to stocking shelves at the grocery store? This man, and there were millions of him, faced a psychological crisis that nobody had a name for yet. Today, we might call it post-traumatic stress. In 1946, they just called it Tuesday. There were no therapists waiting for him, no support groups, no pharmaceutical companies advertising pills on television. He was just supposed to tuck it in and get on with things. And the brutal, uncomfortable, almost criminal truth is this. That pressure, that total absence of a safety net, that complete removal of any other option, forced him to build something real. The world he came back to was not the world we imagine when we think about post-war America. We have this golden image in our heads, barbecues and Chevrolets and smiling housewives. But that image is from the early 1950s. The late 40s were something else entirely. Housing was a catastrophe. In cities across America, veterans were sleeping in car dealerships, in converted military barracks, in basements that had been divided up with bed sheets hanging from the ceiling to create the illusion of separate rooms. There was a shortage of roughly 4 million homes in the United States in 1946. 4 million. That number should stop you cold, because what it means is that millions of men came home from a war, ready to start a family, and there was literally no physical space for them to do it. And the jobs were not exactly waiting with open arms either. During the war, the factories had been running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, churning out rifles and tanks and boots. The moment the war ended, those contracts dried up overnight. Factories laid off workers by the tens of thousands. Women who had been running the assembly lines were pushed back out, and the veterans flooded into a labor market that was lurching and unstable and deeply uncertain about what it was supposed to produce now that it did not need to produce weapons anymore. So you have this man on the train platform, broke, possibly traumatized, no house, no job. And behind him, somewhere, a girl he wrote letters to for 3 years who is waiting for him to come home and be a man. The weight of that expectation alone would crush most people today. We live in an era where men in their 30s still describe themselves as figuring it out. This man did not have the luxury of figuring it out. The clock was ticking from the second his boots hit that platform. What he did next is the part that the motivational speakers always get wrong. They make it sound heroic, like he looked at the horizon with fire in his eyes and declared that he was going to build an empire. That is not what happened. What happened was much more ordinary and much more powerful. He got to work, not because he was inspired, because he was scared. And that distinction matters more than anything else in this entire story. Fear is one of the most misunderstood forces in human history. We talk about it like it is a weakness, like the goal of life is to eliminate fear and operate from a place of calm abundance. That is a philosophy built for people who already have enough. For a man standing on a train platform in 1946 with $12 in his pocket and a duffel bag full of dirty clothes, fear was not a weakness. Fear was a compass. It pointed him directly at what he needed to do. But let us back up even further, because to understand what these men built, you have to understand what they were building on top of. And what they were building on top of was rubble, not just the physical rubble of a war-torn world, but the psychological rubble of the Great Depression. This is the part of the story that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the post-war generation. These men were not starting from nothing in a vacuum. They were starting from nothing after having watched their fathers fail. The men who came back in 1946, most of them had been children during the 1930s. They had watched their fathers lose everything. A man who had a job and a house and a sense of dignity in 1928 could be standing in a bread line by 1931, and there was almost nothing he could have done to prevent it. The system had failed on a scale so massive that it shattered the basic trust between a working man and the economy he lived inside. Think about what that does to a 10-year-old boy. You watch your father, who was supposed to be the strongest person in your world, cry at the kitchen table because he cannot pay rent. You watch your family move out of a house and into a smaller house and then into a room in your grandmother's house. You go to school in shoes with cardboard stuffed inside them because the soles have worn through and there is no money for new ones. You eat meals that are mostly water with a little bit of something floating in them, and your mother calls it soup. You learn at an age when you should be learning that the world is fundamentally safe, that the world is fundamentally not safe, that it can take everything from you without warning and without apology. Those boys grew up to be the veterans of the Second World War, and they carried that lesson inside them like a scar. It shaped everything about how they thought about money, how they thought about security, how they thought about risk. They were not playing with house money, they were playing with survival. Here is the deep irony that nobody ever says out loud. The generation that built the most prosperous middle class in American history was also the generation most psychologically damaged by poverty. They built all that wealth not because they trusted the system, but because they were terrified of what happened when the system collapsed. They were building a wall between themselves and the memory of their fathers standing in bread lines. That is a completely different motivation than anything driving most people today. Today, people try to build wealth because they want nice things, because they want status, because a financial influencer told them that passive income would set them free. Those are motivations built on desire. The men of 1946 were motivated by dread, and dread, it turns out, is a far more reliable engine. Now, let us talk about the mechanics. Let us talk about how specifically, a man with nothing actually built something in the years between 1946 and 1960. Because this is where the real lesson lives, and this is where modern people consistently miss the point. The first thing these men did was reject the idea that they needed permission. This sounds simple. It is not simple. We live inside systems that have trained us from birth to wait for permission. You wait for the school to tell you what to know. You wait for the employer to tell you what your labor is worth. You wait for the bank to tell you whether you deserve a loan. You wait for the market to tell you whether your idea has value. The entire architecture of modern life is built around the idea that some authority somewhere will evaluate you and either grant you access or deny you access. The men coming back from the war in 1946 had just spent years in an environment where waiting for permission got people killed. You did not wait for permission to take cover when you heard gunfire. You moved. You acted. You made decisions with incomplete information, and you lived with the consequences. That reflex did not disappear when they took off the uniform. Consider the story of what happened in Levittown, New York. In 1946, a man named William Levitt looked at the housing crisis and made a decision that would change the shape of American life. He was not the only man to have this idea, but he was one of the men who moved on it without waiting. He took a technique he had learned building military housing during the war, which was essentially the assembly line construction of homes, and he applied it to civilian life. He did not wait for the government to solve the housing crisis. He did not wait for someone to hand him a contract. He went and bought farmland on Long Island and started building. Within a few years, he had created an entire town from nothing, 17,000 homes, 82,000 people. A community that had not existed before, conjured from flat farmland and relentless action. Levitt was exceptional, but the impulse he acted on was not exceptional. It was everywhere, all across America. Men who had learned to stop waiting were starting businesses in their garages, buying buildings that nobody wanted, learning trades, finding needs that weren't being met and meeting them. The economy was not handing them opportunities. They were manufacturing opportunities out of raw necessity. The second thing these men understood, intuitively, without anyone teaching it to them, was the difference between an asset and a liability. Now, a lot of people know these words. A lot of people have read the books and can give you the technical definition. But knowing the definition and having it burned into your nervous system are two completely different things. For the man of 1946, this was not a concept from a book. It was lived experience. An asset was something that could not be taken away in the night. Property, a skill in your hands, a business that produced something people needed. The Depression had taught them that paper wealth was a ghost. Their fathers had had money in banks, and the banks had closed. They had had stocks, and the stocks had evaporated. They had had jobs at companies, and the companies had folded. What you could not take from a man was his knowledge and his land. So they chased those things with an obsession that looked almost pathological to outsiders. The rate of homeownership in America went from roughly 44% in 1940 to 62% in 1960. That is not a gradual drift. That is a stampede. Millions of men deciding simultaneously that they would do whatever it took to plant a flag in the ground and call a piece of earth their own, not because homeownership is inherently wise in every economic environment, but because for these specific men, carrying the specific scars of the specific history they had lived, owning a home was the physical manifestation of safety. It was the opposite of the breadline. It was proof that the floor could not be pulled out from under them. Now here is where the story gets dark. Here is where the cynical investigator in me has to point at something uncomfortable. The system that emerged from the post-war boom was not designed to produce more men like the ones who built it. It was designed to produce consumers. There is a difference. A builder creates value. A consumer transfers it. And somewhere in the late 1950s and early 1960s, while the veterans were busy building their houses and their businesses and their modest little empires, the people who controlled the larger systems of money and production looked at what was happening and made a decision. They decided to sell these men on the idea that they had already made it, that the work was done, that now it was time to enjoy the fruits. Television showed them images of abundance. Advertising told them that the measure of a man was what he owned, not what he built, but what he bought. Credit cards appeared, almost from nowhere, offering the miraculous illusion that you could have things before you had earned them. The whole architecture of desire was constructed around them, and it was masterfully, deliberately done. The men who built the post-war economy were builders by necessity. Their children, raised in the comfortable houses their fathers had scrambled to buy, grew up as the first generation of Americans who were systematically taught to be consumers by design. And here is the cruelest part. The consumption was sold to them as freedom. You are free to buy whatever you want. You are free to express yourself through your possessions. The thing that was never said out loud was the second half of that sentence. You are free to buy whatever you want as long as you keep working to pay for it, which means you are never actually free at all. This is the trap. This is the machine that was built on top of the ruins that those men cleared away. They built a foundation with their bare hands and their deep fear and their absolute refusal to wait for permission, and then the architects of consumption poured a different structure on top of it. One designed not to produce wealth, but to circulate it. Not to create security, but to create the feeling of security, while keeping the underlying anxiety alive, because anxiety is what drives consumption. A man who is genuinely secure does not need to buy things to feel better. A man who is genuinely free does not need to signal his freedom through what he drives. The market needs you slightly, perpetually anxious. It needs you to feel like you are almost there but not quite, almost successful but not quite, almost safe but not quite. That almost is where all the profit is. And so here we are, sitting in the long shadow of what those men built and mostly squandering the inheritance. Not out of laziness, exactly, out of misdirection. We were handed a map that leads to the store instead of a map that leads to the foundation. So what do you do with this? What is the actual, practical, usable lesson from men who started from nothing in 1946? The first lesson is this. Stop waiting for conditions to be perfect. The men who stepped off those trains did not have good conditions. They had terrible conditions. They had a housing shortage and an unstable job market and a generation of psychological damage from the Depression and the war they built anyway. The conditions you have right now, however imperfect, are the only conditions you are going to get. The man who waits for a better moment is the man who ends up waiting forever. The second lesson is harder to hear. You have to learn the difference between spending that builds and spending that consumes. Every dollar you move has a direction. It is either moving towards something that will produce more, or it is moving towards something that will produce nothing except a brief feeling. The man of 1946 made this distinction unconsciously because the memory of the Depression had burned it into them. You have to make it consciously because the system has worked very hard to blur that line for you. The third lesson is the one nobody wants to talk about because it sounds like deprivation. You have to be willing to live smaller than you can afford to. The men who built the most durable wealth in post-war America were not the men who bought the biggest house they could qualify for. They were the men who bought a small house, paid it off, and then used the freedom that came from having no mortgage to take calculated risks on the next thing. They lived in the gap between what they earned and what they spent, and they turned that gap into leverage. Today, that gap has been almost entirely closed by design. The gap is where you live. The gap is where you breathe. The system wants you to close it. The fourth lesson is the one that costs the most. You have to make peace with fear instead of running from it. The men who came back from the war did not have the option of avoiding discomfort. Discomfort was the water they swam in. They learned to function inside it, to make decisions while scared, to move while uncertain, to build while the ground was still shaking. That capacity, that muscle, is the thing that has been most thoroughly atrophied in the modern world. We have built an entire infrastructure of comfort designed to keep fear at bay. And in doing so, we have weakened the exact muscle that turns fear into motion. Here is the final thought, the last, dark, true thing that this story leaves you with. Those men on the train platforms in 1946 were not special. They were not uniquely courageous or uniquely brilliant. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances who had no other choice. The system had stripped away every illusion and left them with only the raw material of themselves. And it turned out that was enough, more than enough. You still have that same raw material. It has not gone anywhere. What has changed is the weather around it. The comfort and the noise and the perfectly engineered distraction that the system provides has made it easy to forget what you are made of. It has made it easy to confuse consuming with living, to confuse the appearance of stability with actual security, to confuse having options with having freedom. The men of 1946 did not have options. They had one option: do the work or disappear. And that singular, brutal clarity was the most valuable thing they possessed. You have to manufacture that clarity yourself, because nobody is going to take away your comfort to give it to you. You have to choose to see through it. You have to choose to remember what is real and what is performance. You have to choose every single day to build instead of buy, to move instead of wait, to act on fear instead of surrendering to it. They started from nothing, and they built everything. The blueprint is still there. It was never hidden. It was just buried under 60 years of very comfortable, very profitable noise. Now you have heard it again. What you do next is entirely up to you.